A 20-year marriage destroyed when she, organizing her documents, discovers that he has another family. She was the image of the perfect wife and mother. Everyone who knew her knew that her life revolved around her family. From an early age, she embraced the role of caregiver, always prioritizing the needs of her husband and children before her own. Her mornings were dedicated to preparing breakfast, taking the children to school, and ensuring the house was always immaculate. Her days were a succession of tasks that she performed with dedication and love. The smile on her face, despite the fatigue, showed the pride she felt in seeing her family united. The husband, with a stable career and frequent business trips, was the financial pillar of the home. He always appeared confident and attentive when he was present, but his work commitments kept him away for long periods. She, on the other hand, never questioned his absences, fully believing that he was doing everything he could to support the family. Every time he left, she reassured the children about the importance of their father's hard work and that, although he was far away, his love for them was immense. Over time, this routine of unwavering dedication and blind trust in her husband became the foundation of her life. She was proud of the home she had built, where every detail reflected her care. No matter how long the husband's trips were, she never doubted his loyalty. After all, she had known him for more than 2 decades and always believed that he was the honest man he appeared to be. But what she didn't know was that behind these absences, there was a reality she could never have imagined discovering. The business trips were frequent, almost part of the routine. He always explained that work required his presence in different cities, which is why he would be away for days, sometimes weeks. She, accustomed to this dynamic, organized the family's life around his comings and goings. Each time he left, there was a farewell ritual. He promised to return as soon as possible, and she, with a smile on her face, wished him success in his meetings. At first, the trips seemed legitimate. He always returned with stories of difficult clients, endless meetings, and signed contracts. He brought gifts for the children and mementos for her, as a way to make up for the time spent away. She never suspected anything. To her, the long absences were simply the price the family paid for his professional success. The man who kissed her at the door as he left was the same man she believed returned with a heart full of longing. As the years passed, the trips became more frequent and longer, but she continued to accept everything naturally. What reassured her most was his calm and confident tone when speaking about the trips. He always said it was for the family's well-being, to ensure the children had the best future possible. She, with her unwavering trust, never imagined that these trips were more than just business commitments. Over time, small details began to emerge, but she ignored them. There were moments when he returned from a trip and seemed distant, as if his mind were elsewhere. He claimed to be tired, and she, as understanding as always, attributed it to work stress. But slowly, she began to notice that some excuses didn't make much sense. One time, he said he had been in a certain city for work, but a credit card bill showed purchases in a completely different place. She, however, was never one to confront. The love and trust she felt for him were so deep that she preferred to ignore the signs. There were nights when he would leave to take work calls and wouldn't return for hours. She told herself it was just the price of being married to a busy businessman. Even when he began traveling on important dates, like wedding anniversaries or special moments for the children, she continued to believe it was all for a good cause. But the signs became increasingly harder to ignore. Friends began to comment on how he was more absent at family events, and the children questioned why their father wasn't present during important moments. Even so, she continued to cling to the image of the perfect husband, the man who, despite all the signs, she still believed to be the pillar of the family. Until one day, reality hit in a way that could no longer be ignored. The discovery came unexpectedly, like a punch to the stomach. She was organizing old papers when she found an envelope with photos of a party. At first, she thought they were photos from one of his business trips, but upon closer inspection, she saw something that made her freeze. He was there, smiling, but he wasn't alone. Beside him, a woman and 2 children, all with equally radiant smiles. What disturbed her most was the intimacy in the photos, as if they were a perfect family, a family she never knew existed. Her heart raced, and a feeling of nausea overwhelmed her. Her mind refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. She tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe they were just friends, maybe it was a misinterpreted situation. But her instincts screamed otherwise. She decided to confront him that night, a mixture of fear and hope that she was mistaken. When he arrived home, he could tell by her look that something was wrong. She held the photos, her voice trembling and tears in her eyes, and asked, "Who are they?" The ensuing silence was deafening. He didn't deny it. With a heavy sigh, he confessed. 20 years of lies, 20 years of a double life that he had masterfully maintained, hidden behind the constant business trips. He had another family. 2 children, a woman, and a home he visited whenever he claimed to be traveling for work. The betrayal she felt at that moment was greater than any physical pain. It was as if the world she knew had been destroyed in a single second, and she was left alone to pick up the pieces. After the devastating confession, silence filled the house. She could barely look at him. Her words failed, and her thoughts were a mess. The only thing clear was that the marriage she had built, believing it to be based on trust and love, had become a farce. She spent sleepless nights trying to understand how she had been deceived for so long. Her husband, on the other hand, seemed indifferent, almost cold in his attitude. He still believed that she would accept the situation, that they could continue as they were, living their separate yet together lives. But for her, there was no going back. The love she had for him wasn't enough to accept living as if nothing had happened. So, with a broken heart, she made a decision she never thought she would have to make: divorce. Deep down, she hoped this decision would make him realize the gravity of what he had done, that it would lead him to fight for the family he had destroyed. But, surprisingly, he didn't fight. He didn't apologize, didn't beg her to stay. He simply accepted the separation, as if it were something inevitable, and moved on. The sense of loss was overwhelming. It wasn't just the end of a marriage but the end of the life she thought she had. That man she had loved for 20 years, the father of her children, turned out to be a stranger. She cried, felt anger, but knew she had to be strong, especially for her children. They, like her, were in shock, trying to deal with the devastation that the truth had brought. And now, besides having to deal with the emotional pain, she would have to face a new challenge: survival without her husband, both financially and emotionally. After the separation, she expected that despite everything, he would continue to support the family financially. After all, he was the father of their children, and even though the marriage was over, there were responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. But once again, reality showed its cruel face. He cut off all financial support, as if he wanted to sever all ties with the family he had abandoned. To him, it was the end of a chapter, and he seemed determined to move on without looking back. His absence wasn't just monetary. He distanced himself completely, emotionally cold and indifferent. There were no more calls, visits, or even superficial concern for the children's well-being. The moments when he used to be a present father became distant and painful memories. The family, already wounded by betrayal, now found itself struggling to survive, both emotionally and financially. The children, who once saw their father as a hero, now had to deal with the deep pain of rejection. She, on the other hand, didn't have time to wallow in sadness. She knew that now the responsibility of supporting the household fell on her shoulders. The days of only taking care of the children and the house were over. Now, she needed to work to ensure that nothing was lacking. Between frustration and exhaustion, she found the strength to get up every day and move forward. Not for herself, but for the children who needed her. And it was in that moment, amidst the pain of abandonment, that a new strength began to grow within her. With her husband's abandonment, she was forced to start from scratch. The feeling of being lost, without a foundation, was overwhelming, but there was no time for despair. She had to take control of the situation and find a way to support the household. The first step was to look for a job, something she hadn't done in decades. Facing the job market after so long seemed like an impossible task. The interviews were tough, the rejections even tougher. But she didn't give up. Every no she received was motivation to keep trying. Her children were also forced to mature quickly. The eldest started working part-time while studying, and the youngest, still a teenager, helped at home, sharing responsibilities. The harmony that once seemed so natural turned into a daily struggle, but this struggle united them in a way they had never experienced before. Together, they found a way to adapt to the new reality. It wasn't easy, and there were days when sadness and exhaustion almost made them fall apart, but the desire to start over was stronger. Even with all the difficulties, there was a flicker of hope that remained alive. She knew that this was just the beginning of a new phase. The hard work, the sacrifices, and the small daily victories were shaping a new version of herself and her family. The moments of uncertainty were still many, but she learned to celebrate the small wins. With each challenge overcome, she felt a renewed strength, a certainty that despite everything, they would survive and find a new way to live, together. Over time, the daily struggle for survival made the family more united than ever. They learned to lean on each other in moments of weakness, developing a collective strength they never imagined they had. The void left by the father's absence became a kind of fuel to keep moving forward. She, once completely emotionally and financially dependent on her husband, now saw herself as the true pillar of the home. The children, in turn, discovered the importance of being together in every battle. The nights, once filled with long family conversations, were now replaced by discussions on how to save money, how to find new sources of income, and how to balance the little they had. But even amidst the difficulties, there were moments of lightness. The dinner table, now less abundant, was still a space for laughter, stories, and the growing bond between them. The pain of abandonment still existed, but it had been overshadowed by a new sense of belonging and resilience. They were rebuilding, brick by brick, the foundation of a new life. The process of starting over not only brought challenges but also discoveries. She, who had always been the dedicated wife and mother, began to rediscover her own identity. She felt that, for the first time in years, she was living for herself. Her children, seeing her strength, learned that life, even with all its betrayals and falls, can be reinvented. And it was in this strengthening, in this new union that was formed, that they began to realize that, despite all the suffering, they were building something even more valuable, the ability to overcome any adversity. While the family found strength and resilience, the ex-husband faced a very different reality. Without the support of the wife who had emotionally sustained the facade he had created for years, his life began to fall apart. The mistress, who had seemed like an exciting escape, soon grew tired of the situation. The glamour of being the other woman faded, and the lies he had built began to turn against him. They separated, and this time, he found himself completely alone. He had lost not only his wife and children but also the mistress and the lifestyle he had tried to maintain. His career, once his pride, began to decline. He could no longer maintain the same focus or dedication, and the professional image he had built over the years began to deteriorate. The trips that used to take him away from home now had no meaning, and the emptiness he felt grew larger every day. With no one to share his successes or failures, the weight of his past choices began to slowly crush him. The confident, successful man he had always appeared to be was now just a shadow of what he once was. With his health deteriorating and his emotional weariness, he realized that he was reaping the bitter fruits of his actions. The children, who once idolized him, now avoided him. And the regret began to grow within him, but it seemed too late to repair the damage. He had made choices that led him down this lonely path, and for the first time in a long time, he looked back and realized what he had lost. But there was still a flicker of hope, distant as it was, the forgiveness of his family. Even after the collapse of his previous life, the ex-husband tried once more to rebuild his life. He met another woman, younger, who saw in him an opportunity for financial stability. Little by little, he became involved in a new relationship, and soon, they were married. To him, this seemed like a chance to start over, to erase the mistakes of the past and, perhaps, live a new life without the shadows of previous betrayals. Over time, they had a child, something that reignited in him the desire to be a good father again, but the situation was different this time. The relationship with his new wife, however, was distant and superficial. She was more interested in his position and money than in building a true connection. He realized this but didn't have the strength to face yet another disappointment. The marriage, which was supposed to be a new chance, soon revealed itself to be full of difficulties. As the years passed, the relationship became cold and filled with resentment. He began to see that this new life, though different, did not fulfill him. He was once again surrounded by voids that he had created himself. Despite his efforts to reconnect with his new child, the guilt for having neglected his other children continued to haunt him. Every smile he saw on the face of his new child reminded him of the absences and lies that had marked his first family. He began to realize that, although he had started over, the scars of the past had not disappeared. Slowly, he was overcome by the need to correct his previous mistakes, to seek the forgiveness of those who truly mattered. But he knew that time was running out, and that this reconciliation needed to happen soon, before it was too late. Years passed, and the ex-husband felt the weight of age approaching quickly. His health began to deteriorate, and the strength he had to continue sustaining the image of a successful man was fading. The lonely nights, once filled with excuses and justifications, were now dominated by thoughts of regret and pain. He knew he had made unforgivable mistakes, but the desire to be forgiven, to have a bit of peace, grew within him like a flame that refused to go out. He began to wonder if there was still time to fix things, to seek the forgiveness of his children. Those he had left behind, whose lives he had devastated with his lies. The fear of judgment was great, but the fear of dying without resolving these issues was even greater. He wrote letters, tried making phone calls, but the guilt prevented him from being direct. He knew that what he needed was the courage to face the past, not to run from it again. Finally, in a gesture of humility that hadn't been seen in decades, he decided to personally seek out his children. He didn't know what to expect, perhaps indifference, perhaps anger, perhaps a deafening silence that would confirm that he no longer had a place in their lives. But, even with a heavy heart and deteriorating health, he knew this was his last chance. He wasn't just seeking forgiveness, but the redemption of a man who finally understood the extent of his failures and the pain he had caused those he loved most. With the decision made, he faced his greatest fears and went to meet his children. The first conversation was the hardest. Gathering them in the afternoon, in an attempt to resolve decades of hurt and pain, seemed almost impossible. But, to his surprise, the children, although wounded, were willing to listen. The anger they had carried for so long began to dissipate as he sincerely expressed his regret. The words were painful to say, but even more painful for them, as they listened to their father confess the mistakes that had hurt them for so many years. The children, now adults and marked by their father's choices, listened to each word with a mix of emotion and relief. It wasn't easy to accept the request for forgiveness, as the years of suffering and abandonment were still fresh in their memories. But something began to change at that moment. They realized that holding on to resentment wouldn't bring the peace they so desperately sought. One by one, the children began to forgive their father, not as an absolution of his wrongs, but as a way to free themselves from the weight of the past. Reconciliation didn't happen all at once, but it was a gradual process. They decided to slowly reconnect, without rushing, respecting the wounds that were still healing. Each gesture, each meeting, each conversation seemed to stitch together the wounds that had been open for so long. The father, now elderly and with deteriorating health, began to feel that, despite everything, there was a chance for him to leave in peace. What mattered most to him wasn't just the forgiveness, but the fact that he saw his family reunited again, something he thought he had destroyed forever. The family reunion happened on a quiet day, without major events or significant dates. What made that moment special was the presence of everyone together, something that hadn't happened in decades. The father, now more fragile, felt his heart warm seeing his children talking and laughing, without the tension that used to permeate each meeting. He knew that this moment represented something much bigger than just a family gathering. It was proof that, despite all the mistakes and hurt, the family was still capable of coming together. The children, who had carried the pain of abandonment for so long, finally began to feel at peace. It wasn't as though the past had been erased, but they realized that reconciliation wasn't about forgetting what happened, but about accepting that, even in the midst of pain, there was room for forgiveness and healing. The father, watching their interaction, felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: gratitude. He was thankful to still be there to witness that moment, something he thought he'd never live to see. As the day went on, the light and relaxed atmosphere brought back memories of childhood, of the games and laughter that once echoed through the house when everything seemed perfect. But now, there was a new kind of harmony. A harmony built not on illusions but on the acceptance of human flaws and the genuine desire to start over. For the father, this was the greatest gift he could have, to see his children together, talking, smiling, and finally feeling like a family again. With his health steadily declining, the ex-husband knew that his days were numbered. He spent his final moments surrounded by his children, something he never thought would happen. Their presence by his side brought a peace he hadn't felt in decades. Though frail, he cherished every visit, every conversation, as if they were gifts. The weight of the guilt that had accompanied him for so many years now felt lighter, now that he had found forgiveness and reconciliation with those who mattered most. The children, who once carried so much resentment, now saw him in a different light. He wasn't the perfect man they remembered from their childhood, but he also wasn't the villain who caused so much suffering. He was human, with grave flaws, but someone who, in the end, sought to correct his mistakes. They spent their days reminiscing about old stories, rediscovering memories that had been forgotten, and for a brief moment, the feeling of family once again filled that empty space. In his final days, the ex-husband felt that, despite everything, he was leaving in peace. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but having his family reunited again was enough for him to go without the burden of regret. And so, with everyone by his side, he closed his eyes for the last time, knowing that, in some way, forgiveness and love had prevailed. It was a peaceful end, one he never imagined he would have. After the father's passing, the atmosphere among the children was serene. The sadness of loss was present, but there was also a sense of peace. The forgiveness they had given their father not only freed him but also freed them from a lifetime of resentment. They realized that the true legacy their father left wasn't material but the lesson that forgiveness has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. The family, which had been fragmented for so long, now felt more united than ever. The moments shared in their father's final days were like a balm, healing what had once seemed impossible to heal. They learned that, despite all the mistakes and disappointments, family love can be reclaimed, even in the darkest moments. Forgiveness brought with it a sense of relief, and the children, who once avoided talking about their father, could now remember him with respect and understanding. The harmony he had longed for in his last years of life had finally been achieved. Over time, this newfound unity solidified, and the family continued to support one another, keeping the legacy of forgiveness and understanding alive in their lives. They knew that the scars of the past would always be there, but instead of causing pain, they now served as reminders of overcoming. The father passed in peace, and the children went on with their lives, certain that love and forgiveness were the true inheritances he had left behind. Did you enjoy the story? If so, leave your comment below and tell me what you thought. I'd love to know your opinion. Don't forget to like if the story moved you, and if you have suggestions for new stories, share them with me. I'm always open to new ideas and can't wait to create more stories that touch the heart. See you next time.